Thanks, Suzanne, and thanks everybody. It's turning a little bit late here in Melbourne, but it's still good to be here. Sorry I couldn't be with you there. I just spent the last year in Germany, but had to come back a couple of months ago as my sabbatical ended in Heidelberg. My name is Duane Hamacher. I'm an associate professor of cultural astronomy in the School of Physics at the University of Melbourne here in Australia. And I specialize in astronomy and culture, mostly Indigenous astronomy in Australia, working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, but also working with communities across the world. As was said before, I was one of the founding members of the original working group, and we were able to include a number of Aboriginal star names from across Australia in the initial groupings of stars that we had named. And it was a great opportunity to do that because one of the challenges we face, not only in just assigning names to stars, but when you're working in colonized countries like Australia, um, there are real concerns about recognition of Indigenous names and Indigenous ways of knowing. So the work that we're doing in Australia and is seeing this happening all around the world focuses on decolonizing Western science. And here in Australia, this has a lot of different applications. And one of them, of course, is recognizing traditional names and ways of knowing about stars. So it all tied in quite beautifully. What I wanted to do was go in and talk about some of the star names that we approved here in Australia. But as I do that, talk about some of the challenges that we face in this particular space, and how we've tried to overcome some of those challenges, how some of those challenges are ongoing, and how we can hopefully overcome some of them into the future. So in not the original batch, but I think the second batch, we included a number of Aboriginal names from Australia. Now, the first one that I want to talk about are the handful of names that come from the Waddaman people. This is a particular language group from the Northern Territory. So I should clarify for those of you who may not know much about Australia that there are hundreds of distinct languages in Australia. They're not just dialectical variations of the same language. They're all unique and independent languages. About 2/3 or so of the country of Australia speaks Pamanungan languages, which are a particular family that spread out from Queensland about 7,000 years ago. But there are a number of families up in the Northern Territory, which you can see up around Waddaman, which are all unique families. And each of them are going to have their own names, their own traditions, representing their own languages. And it's important to remember that Aboriginal traditions, Aboriginal people have been in Australia for 65,000 years continuously. And that also applies to New Guinea as well. So you have got a very deep time rich database, I don't really want to call it a database, but a repository of knowledge about star names that goes back a very long time. Now, the Waddaman language, we're very fortunate to have quite a few potential star names in that. Several have been approved, and there's potential for more to be approved by our working group. Now, a lot of this knowledge, or actually all of this knowledge in particular, comes from Idamdumma Bill Harney. He is a senior Waddaman elder. He is the last fully initiated custodian of traditions. He's in his 90s and he's still kicking along just fine. He is the son of an Aboriginal woman and the famous Australian white anthropologist Bill Harney, Sr. Idamdumma was almost taken away from his family during a period in Australian history, a very disturbing period in Australian history known as the Stolen Generations, where Aboriginal children who were slightly lighter skinned were taken away from their families and placed in white families and white care and never saw their family again. He was taken by his mother when they saw the government cars coming, rushed out into the bush, and she took black charcoal and covered his face and his body so he would look darker. Unfortunately, his sister was taken. He never saw her again. So these, telling you about this gives you some context about the colonial history of Australia and why doing this stuff can be so important. Now, we're very fortunate that Idundama Bilharni has written two books on his traditional astronomy, Dark Sparklers in 2003 and Four Circles in 2015. Dark Sparklers in particular details a huge amount of information about traditional stars, knowledges, their names, what they mean. And there are Wadman names. People who work with him say he has 3,000 names for stars in the sky. And the book cites hundreds. So it's a rich resource from a living elder who can work with this and talk about these stars, and he has. And when we had this first batch of star names approved, I did seek his permission for that, and that was something he was very happy about. So this is the book in particular, Dark Sparklers, that was published in 2003. The first detailed Indigenous astronomy from a particular Aboriginal community, not just a broad survey across Australia, but the first one that was quite detailed. And it is very difficult to get through, I'm not going to lie. That was published between Uncle Bilharni and Hugh Cairns. So we can see here's some screenshots of the inside back of the book, where there's quite a bit of text in the book that talks about what the stuff means. But what I want to get to the point of talking to you about here is that in traditional ways of knowing are quite different from Western ways of knowing, particularly in the astronomy space. In the Western astronomy space, we have distinct constellation boundaries. There's a constellation with a clear-cut boundary. It has one name and kind of one meaning. In Indigenous knowledges, there can be multiple names. There could be multiple constellations overlapping and laid over top of each other. They can go by multiple names and multiple meanings depending on the context, depending on the time of the year, or even the time of the day. So if we look to the Torres Strait, for example, there's a giant constellation called Tagai, and it comprises stars in Lupus and Lupus and Centaurus, and the Southern Cross and Corvus are his hands, and all the stars trace out his body, and he's standing in his canoe, which is Scorpius, and Sagittarius is this sucker fish hanging off the bottom of that. But that same part of the Milky Way, which is described as more of the darker spaces, is also seen as shovel-nosed ray, where the dust of the Milky Way is seen as silt in the bottom of the reefs that he's kicking up as he goes along the bottoms of that. And the orientation of that will tell you important information about navigation. So if you were to look on, we put this into Stellarium, they'd be directly overlapping each other. It would look quite complicated putting all of this information in there. So this is one of the things that we're trying to work our way through when we're developing programs for Stellarium and planispheres. How do you address situations where a star can have multiple names, where it can have multiple meanings, and even multiple interpretations about what it is that can overlap? It becomes a real challenge. But we can start off by looking at some of the stars in this. Now, in traditional Wadman culture, the stars tell a story, and they all have meaning and importance. Now, the stars in the constellation of Scorpius describes a procession during an initiation ceremony. And each of the stars represents a person or a character in that narrative and their particular role in that initiation ceremony, which extends well beyond Scorpius. But that curve of stars in Scorpius, that's very easy to see, is very conspicuous, tells of this particular kind of procession. And it talks about how Nadi and Dungdung are the two main ancestor figures. They are the pointer stars Alpha and Beta Centauri. And that the ceremonial law is embodied by Mirrabina, which is seen as the red star Antares. Now, red stars are extremely important in cultural traditions, indigenous traditions in Australia and around the world. Larawag in particular is one of the first ones that we approved, and he is somebody who gives the all clear signal when people are transitioning through this part of the ceremony, which has a lot of secret, sacred elements to it. And this is another challenge that we're going to be facing when we're looking at star names from indigenous cultures and contexts. Is in many cultures there will be information that is considered secret, sacred, and That means that elements of that knowledge may not be able to be shared. Perhaps it's all of it, perhaps only parts of it. And who is allowed to access that information, who's allowed to even say the words, can depend on levels of initiation, community, family ties, or even gender. So in Australia, a lot of knowledge is considered either men's business or women's business. If it's men's business, only men are to talk about that and discuss that. And punishment for men learning women's business, even by accident or vice versa, in a lot of traditions is very severely punished, in some cases by death. That's not something that really happens much today, but you do hear about instances of people finding themselves in a women's place or a men's place, and they get out of there as quickly as possible. So the context of this is that when we're looking for indigenous names, we have all these challenges that we have to face. Another one of them is Wurin, and Wurin is in the constellation of Phoenix. And it's quite fascinating to see the relationship between the different stars and how they link together. And like I said, a particular star name can have, or a particular star can have multiple names and kind of multiple meanings with that. But all the stars, as indigenous cultures and elders describe, everything on the land is reflected in the sky. As is above, so is below. So if you want to understand how things are related and how they work on the ground, you can see them mapped out in the sky. So whether it's a procession of a ceremony that's mapped out in the sky, which is used to teach younger generations, or you can see the relationship between animals. So anthropomorphized animals in the sky or ancestral figures, their relationship to each other can be both spatial and temporal. So we can see in the stars, their journeys mapped out based on their coordinates, their right ascension and declination, which might tell you their motions and how long they're going to be in the sky. Their relative positions to each other have importance. And also temporally, when these stars rise or set at dusk and dawn, can tell you things about changing seasons that link to their specific behaviors. And of course, weather patterns and harvesting of gardens and all these other sorts of factors. So we see the narratives in this mapped out, and you have to pick individual stars of particular declinations and right ascensions that coincide with the temporal changes in a particular season or the behavior of an animal or a plant or something along that line. As most of us would recognize, you can't just pick any star for it to be a seasonal star. You've got to pick something that's going to be in the sky for the duration of time that is going to coincide to whatever event you're representing on the Earth. Now, this star in particular turned out to be a huge ordeal. Jena is considered as part of the ceremonial procession that happens in the sky as a dilly bag, a small bag filled with songs of knowledge. Now, in oral cultures, of course, information is passed on through narrative, through story, also through song and dance, which are very, very powerful. And it's also describing the relationship between the different stars and how they link together. One thing I did want to mention in the previous one, I think it's this one here, going back, we look at certain particular stars, like Betelgeuse is seen right here as the owl eye flickering. Now, it's interesting because when we're talking about this, we could see that perhaps as stellar scintillation. And stellar scintillation is a concept utilized by indigenous cultures to forecast weather. But it's also interesting because there are Aboriginal traditions from more than one community in Australia that talk about the variability of these stars, and Betelgeuse is one of those in particular. So going back to Jena, in the Australian context, the main reason this one became so wildly popular is because it's one of the stars in the Southern Cross. The Southern Cross is, as everybody knows, the smallest of the 88 constellations that features on the flags of 5 different Southern Hemisphere nations. But in Australia, it is the symbol of Australia. It defines what it means to be Australian. It's the Southern Cross. It is a symbol, for better and for worse. It's seen as a symbol of unity that brings everybody together, but in the last 20 years, it's become very much a nationalistic symbol of white supremacy, of colonialism. So this has been such a challenge in Australia that an Aboriginal filmmaker named Warwick Thornton produced a film in 2017 called We Don't Need a Map. And it was all about the Southern Cross, the symbolism of the Southern Cross, how he had described it as the new swastika in Australia. And he got in a bit of trouble for that by people who were using it very much in that context. So to be able to formally name one of the stars in the Southern Cross, the fifth brightest star in the Southern Cross, globally with an Aboriginal name was huge in Australia. It had a massive impact. And that was something that I didn't even expect until I had published a paper in The Conversation, an article in The Conversation, talking about the names of these stars. Much of what I'm showing you now came from that article. And we were getting bombarded by media requests wanting to know this star in the Southern Cross that we had renamed. So the influence of what we're doing here may not always come through in the scientific community. Like, we may not hear of scientists who care much about what the name of the star is unless they have to change their usage of it. But in the public sphere, the recognition of names with indigenous names and changing them and having this sort of impact is huge. It is massive. And it's been something that has been incorporated into the science curriculum here in Australia. So this is something that has found itself in the Australian national curriculum. So every school student from preschool through year 12 learns about Guinan, learns about these Aboriginal star names. And it's quite fascinating to look and see how the representations of these stars link in with the behavior of the animals. So Gudja in particular, Kappa serpentis, is considered a water goanna, this lizard. And its behaviors, its breeding season, tie into when these stars rise and set at dusk and dawn. So we can see the multiple layers of meaning tied in with them and show how they're part of this procession in the sky. They're linked to other stars within that constellation, nearby constellations, to tell these overall narratives that map out stories in the stars, but they also map out song lines. And song lines are travel routes that go all the way across the country. And these travel routes, they work kind of like waypoints on a map. So if you have to go to point A to point B, you have to figure out the best route, where the natural landscape features are going to help you navigate, where you're going to find food and water and medicine, where you're going to set up camp. And in Australia, these song lines can span multiple language groups and be sung in different languages, but all be connected together. And they're represented as a reflection in the sky. So the elders will teach younger generations these routes by identifying stars in the sky that roughly coincide with the routes, these pathways of these song lines. But when people travel these pathways for trade and ceremony, they're not traveling at night following the stars. They use the stars as a mental map, as a mnemonic. And what's quite fascinating is today, if you look at the layout of these song lines, they're travel routes in places where you would camp, right? So when colonists started spreading across Australia, they would follow these same song lines. And those pathways became roads and highways, and those camps became settlements, towns, and regional cities. And what's really fascinating about this is if you take maps of the stars and Google Maps and you place them over top of each other, they synchronize quite wonderfully. It means that most of the highway networks in towns in Australia are actually based on Aboriginal star maps. Now, another thing I wanted to bring forward that's come as a bit of a challenge for us and still actually hasn't been resolved, I think it's been left alone and it's just going to be left as it is, comes from the Burong people. So the Burong people represent the first recorded Indigenous astronomy traditions published in Australia back in the 1850s. And they're from the northwestern part of Victoria. The name Burong is the clan name of the Worgaya language group, and Burong actually means night. And they prided themselves on being the best astronomers in the region. Now, among their many traditions was a description of one called Nunurganite. And this was the star Delta Canis Majoris. So if you see Canis Major, this is the back leg of the dog. And it's sort of like, I guess, the dog's knee. You'd have one star, which is the hip, one's the knee, and one is the foot. I guess is the best way to put that. And this star is described as a Jackie lizard. And it gets in this battle with the moon. The moon tries to steal one of his wives, which are the two stars flanking him on either side. And it's the star that is closest to the ecliptic that the moon, which is considered Mityan, the quoll, which is the animal you see on the right, tried to steal away his wife, and they got into a battle, and Mityan got his backside kicked pretty badly and roams around the heavens as the moon. And the mare on the moon are the spots on the quoll, which were seen as bruises during the fight. And that was quite interesting because it seems that, I don't know if this is actually the case, but on rare occasions, when the moon reaches its furthest most position, the standstill position actually, it can go over top of that particular star, where the other star further away was not identified. So an interesting element of that. But what's important about this is the spelling and linguistic issues that we're going to face. These are oral cultures. They don't have structured written languages. So how do we go about structuring through the IAU these types of names? How do we deal with these kinds of challenges? So these documented star knowledges were published by an Englishman named William Stambridge back in the 1850s from knowledge he had collected in the 1840s. And the process of us getting this name formalized through the Aboriginal community, the official government recognized organization, they initially said, yes, that's fine. But then later on, after we had already approved it and used it and put it out in the public, they said, oh, well, now we're working with linguists to formalize a structured written version of our language. And the new version that we have has a different spelling. And that has created challenges. We're like, okay, well, how do we fix that? How do we spell it? And the newer spelling of that kind of looks like it doesn't fit. I seem to have forgotten to put it on here. The new version of the spelling you can find online if you go just Google Nurganite. But also the pronunciation of it, how they want to go back to the original pronunciation of this. These pose challenges, and we went back and forth with the Aboriginal community. How are we going to do this? What do you want? And initially they were going to give us information about that to help us fix that. But as many of these community organizations face, there becomes a change of the guard. And the people who were there left for whatever reason, new people come in and stuff gets lost in the pipeline. And these are some of the challenges that we have faced and we are going to face in the future. In addition to addressing the challenges of multiple names for the single object, multiple meanings, how they all relate together is quite fascinating, but we have to deal with the challenges of spelling and linguistics. We also have to deal with the challenges of permissions. So some of these communities, there may only be one or two elders left who can talk to us about it. In Gamilaroi Uwalye, one of the senior elders, Uncle Gillar, Michael Anderson, he's one of the few senior initiated members of the community. So he's got the power to say, yes, you can use this star name from his own perspective as a senior member of that community. Whereas other communities are so large, there's so many members of that community that getting a unified permission would be almost impossible. And there are going to be people who love it, and there are going to be people who don't love it. Now, Uncle Gillar, who incidentally, both him and Uncle Bill Leadham Maharney have asteroids named after them. That was something I was able to work out with the Small Body Nomenclature Working Group, which again had a humongous impact here in Australia. One of the asteroid names is Miriam, which is the community I work with in the Eastern Torres Strait, and their senior elder had an asteroid named after him. When I made up some certificates when everything was approved and I sent it over to them, they held a whole ceremony on the island and the elders were in tears talking about a piece of them is named in the sky. So again, when it comes to star names and asteroid names, the implications and impact of this is huge, and it goes well beyond what many of us might realize or even hear in our professional capacity in the astronomy community. This last name I wanted to bring up, or the last two, I hope I'm not going over time. Suzanne, please let me know if I'm going a bit over.
5 minutes left.
5 minutes, great. So surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, faint stars are identified and have meaning. So in this case, the star 36 off Yukai is a relatively faint star called Gunnibu, which relates to the robin redbreast bird. Also relates to a budgerigar, which is another small, colorful bird represented by the star Kappa Scorpii, which is just nearby in Scorpius. They border each other. There are star names in Aboriginal traditions that are quite faint, or from representing stars that are very faint. I know that working with Chris Cannon, who I think he's completed his PhD now, or he's about to, in Athabascan Northern Dene astronomy in Alaska and Northern Canada, recorded stars that were incredibly faint. Visible, of course, but we're talking like fifth, sixth magnitude and 6.5 magnitude, like barely on the scope of human visibility. But there's a whole huge capacity for us to find these names within these indigenous traditions, because most of them don't have standard Western names in that context. Like 36 Alphi would be what we would call that star. And the last one I want to mention was another really important one that came out of the Name Exoworlds campaign. This is Narwheat Caroline Briggs. Narwheat is a Bunurong word that means leader. So it's not her name, it's a title. And the Bunurong people are an Aboriginal people of the southern half of Melbourne, going down towards Wilson's Promenade in central Victoria. So one of the two major Aboriginal groups that intersect here, and actually one of the three major Aboriginal groups that intersect here in Melbourne. Melbourne, of course, being an enormous city of 5.5 million people, second largest in Australia. Her grandson, Jaden, actually nominated to names Bupup and Yanyan to refer to the exoplanet HD 38283b in the constellation Mensa. This is the 7th magnitude star, the host star, and the exoplanet is a Saturn size star that orbits in an Earth-like distance from this exo world. So of course it becomes an interesting topic for potential life, perhaps on a moon. But this star was given the name of Boy and the planet of Child. So this was the Australia-wide name for this. Also became quite a huge thing here and had a significant impact on the community. And this also impacts our professional relationships with those communities. Our ability to put these names forward, have them recognized globally, is a fantastic opportunity for those of us working on the ground here to be able to build and foster those relationships with the communities as part of what we call the giving back process. Communities able to share knowledge with us, we have to be able to demonstrate ways we're going to be giving back to those communities. That may be the form of educational programs and curricula, of exhibitions and shows, but having asteroid names and star names recognized is huge. It's not tangible, but it is something that can really take us a very long way. It's also, talking about these challenges, the reason that we have to be very vigilant and very careful about how we do this, because it's very easy to make a mistake. And in this space in Australia, if you make a mistake, it can have devastating consequences. Your professional relationship can be ruined, and you're going to be out of, that can destroy your livelihood. So it's one of the challenges that we face. We have to be very vigilant, very cautious about the protocol and how we go about doing things. But we have to acknowledge that astronomer time and Aboriginal time do not work together very well. In Aboriginal communities, they'll get to things when they get to things. And in the Western academic spectrum, we've always got deadlines and things that have to be done. And we have to acknowledge that with Indigenous communities in Australia and around the world, they're going to have different expectations, they're going to have different desires, they're going to have different concepts about what should and shouldn't be done, they're going to have different ideas about timelines. But there is a huge benefit, mutual benefit, that we can see if we get these things done right. And so far, we've got 7 or 8 stars now that are already named, and they've had a very, very positive impact. Thank you so much.